Hi folks, Slick Slices here. I'm going to do a um, little series of things on my Japanese knives. A little while ago, I used to collect just anything with a sharp edge, and things started to get a little bit out of hand. I ended up collecting all sorts of knives, and some of which I was pleased with and some I wasn't. So I decided to rationalise things and come up with some sort of loose rules about knives that I would collect, rather than just buying everything. And so I kind of said, my principal collecting aim is English or British folding pocket knives. So I have a pretty good sort of collection of Taylor's Eyewitness and one or two other bits and pieces. But in addition to that, I sort of decided I wouldn't collect American knives, because I thought if I go down the GEC rabbit hole, I'll end up getting lost, and probably the Red Queen will have my head. So I'll not do that. So I decided I would buy European knives, traditionally made European knives, and I would buy Japanese knives because I have a thing about Japan, and then there's a drawer in my collection for sort of statement pieces, particularly special pieces. So there's a couple of Chris Reeves in there, and Medford and stuff like that that really stand out on their own. But as I say, one section of my collection is Japanese knives. I don't have an awful lot, but I do have some quite nice ones. So I'm going to show those over a series. But I'm going to start with the basics, really. So today I'll just have a look at the Higonokami knives. Now, these have a sort of place in Japanese history because I'll give you a little potted history of the way Japan sort of developed. You may know that in the 16th century, Japan had a sort of big warring period. There was a whole century of fairly dramatic wars, but they ended with the Battle of Sanatagahara in 1600, and the Tokugawa sort of shogunate came out of that. It wasn't really founded until 1603, but the Tokugawa shogunate ran then from 1603 through to towards the end of 1857, and when Tokugawa Yoshinobu effectively surrendered the powers of the shogunate back to the emperor. There'd been an emperor all the way through, but he was effectively a puppet of the shogunate. But the emperor took control of Japan from, I think it was 3rd of January 1858 is the actual date. Part of that meant that the samurai, who had effectively had power of life and death over all people in Japan for centuries, were kind of were overthrown, and certain things they weren't allowed to wear their top knots, and most importantly, they weren't allowed to carry swords. And the wearing of two swords, a katana, long sword, and the wakizashi, the short sword, was the badge of a samurai, and that was withdrawn, and that meant that all of those swordsmiths that had for centuries spent their entire lives making swords for samurais, because there were an awful lot of samurais. I think at Sanatagahara there were 40,000 heads taken. And the samurai used to take heads so that they could get paid, because they got paid for the number of heads that they took, and they got the special glory, as it were, gory glory, that for special heads. So there were a lot of the samurai, and so there was a big business in people making swords. They were all out of work and they had to do something else. And one of the things that they started doing was making more domestic cutlery. And the Higonokami, which is what these are, comes out of that period. Higo was a city in Japan, and Higonokami effectively means the prefect or daimyo of Higo. I don't know who the particular. My knowledge of Japanese history is not great. You've heard most of it, and it's what's prompted me to sort of talk about these things is that I read a couple of books lately. I read James Clavell's Shogun, which is a very fictionalized version of the period leading up to 1600, up to Satakahara, from the view of a fictionalized British sailor. It's the story has some truth, but it's a bit like, Braveheart is Scottish history. It's a fictionalized story, but it does give you some idea of that period. And I also read then a book called Minamoto Musashi. Minamoto Musashi is a real person, and it's a sort of historical book, but it's, anybody that writes a story has to make the story larger than life. But Minamoto Musashi, it starts with the Battle of Satakahara and the setting up of the Tokugawa shogunate. Well, anyway, the shogunate came to an end in 1868, and the cutlers were left trying to do something. So here they were. They made a simple little knife, and they really don't come much more simple than this. I mean, this one has the flashy advantage of coming in a leather case, but that doesn't make it particularly special. I did have this on my keyring for a bit. The case is sort of quite nice, but I thought I'd probably end up tearing the little tag off the back if I did it for too long. So I went back to the old Swiss Army knife on the keyring. Now they're made in the two I have are brass, but they're not always brass. You get them in steel, Japan steel, black steel, and then inside they have fairly simple blades. Now you do get some that are more flashy than this, with sort of better grindings, which perhaps are more reminiscent of Japanese swords, with a kisagi and a yakoti line and all of the stuff that you get there. These ones here, I think this one is it's blue paper steel, I think. Blue paper steel and white paper steel are the two sort of traditional Japanese ones. White paper steel is a purer carbon steel, and blue paper steel is sometimes it says a lower grade steel, but it has other things in it to make it a better, a more sort of rust resistant and so forth steel. It's not necessarily lower quality, but these are old-fashioned steels. These are not modern powdered steels or anything like that. One thing you will see about these, and I don't know if it'll come across on the camera at all, but there is a line which runs along the blade just here. Now this isn't a ham-on line, it's not a heat treatment line. It is because this is actually a Sanmai construction knife, and you may or may not see that on the back, but there are 3 layers of steel, so you have a harder layer of steel in the middle and softer layers on the outside. In this case, they're not different steels, they're just a harder steel and a softer steel, and then they're forge welded together. Now, I don't know much about Japanese writing. The one thing I do know is that for some reason every knife has to have almost every range has to have a model called the Higo, and those first 4 characters there say the word Higo. I know that because it comes up quite frequently. I don't know what the rest of the characters mean. I would love to know. There's more there than Nokami, but I'd love to really know. Now, there's nothing to hold these blades open except the extended tang, so you can put your finger or your thumb, sorry, on the end of that tang and hold it open. Now, these were very common. Every schoolboy in Japan had one of these to sharpen his pencils. But in I think it was the late 60s actually, it was quite a long time, before we had stupid knife laws in Britain, but they were outlawed in Japan because there were a number of people being cut by them. People using them as sort of schoolyard weapons, so they became less common. This one, slightly larger one, I bought this because it's a Damascus steel. Now, I'm not a big fan of Damascus steel. It always seems to me that in the current age of powdered metal steels, the idea of taking two steels and mixing them together in the sort of crude way of a Damascus steel is a bit pointless, because you can't improve the steel by doing that. You can only make it less effective. Now, but this one is again a Sanmai construction. So you've Damascus steel, 2 layers of Damascus steel. I don't know if you can see that on the back there, but there's 2 layers of Damascus steel with a layer of straightforward blue paper steel in the middle. So it doesn't destroy the quality of the steel in the same way that making a fully Damascus steel blade is. This one also has a sort of easy open notch here, which again are quite common, quite often a little lanyard thing. But the handle is just a folded piece of metal. As I say, in this case, it's brass. The blades are better than you would think. They sharpen up very well. It's the same material that is used for Japanese chisels and planes. And if you ever have the chance to handle Japanese chisels, a name of which I cannot remember, but they make very, very good, very hard chisels. They usually are in the Rockwell well into the 60s. I don't know that these are, although the steel isn't soft. This is actually quite a hard steel. When you come to sharpen them, you think it's going to be like sharpening up a Swiss Army knife, but it isn't. They are actually quite... they're not hard to sharpen. I mean, there's nothing more difficult about sharpening. It just takes longer because, reducing that steel. So you kind of think you just give it a quick strop and it's going to be razor sharp. And you find actually it takes a little bit more effort, but the effort is rewarded and they do hold an edge quite well. Now, I don't think I have very much more to say about those. As I say, that they came in the Meiji period. By the late 20s and early 30s, Japan had decided to sort of militarise, and they between 1934 and 1945, they made more swords than all the swords made in all the period up until 1934. And not a lot of them were very special. One day I have a sword made in 1936, which is a very special sword. One day I will do a video on it, but it needs a whole video set up, and I haven't quite worked out how to do that yet. But anyway, so but these carried on through. These survived through the war and right up, say, until 60s or 70s, and at that time they started to become less popular in Japan. But they're always available across the world. They're not very expensive. You could have a collection of these all on their own, and one day I hope I'll get some more. Anyway, I think that's enough of that. Enough of that for now. 14 minutes on the Higonokami is, I think, a lot. So, thank you very much for watching. If you like this stuff, give it a thumbs up. There are a series of these Japanese knives coming up, some rather more exotic than this. So please subscribe, ring the bell, and you will see them as they come along. Thank you very much. Bye.